What's up guys, General Prime here. I want to talk about an issue that's been a topic of debate for so long, that spawned countless arguments as well as videos right here on YouTube, and believe me, I've been watched a shit ton of debates both for and against this topic, and that is, drumroll please, the Christian creation story. Now my point of this video essay is not to give my personal opinion about the matter or talk about who is right or wrong, because I think that it is futile to try to change the minds of people who are naturally biased about their beliefs. Instead, what I'm trying to do is sort of an experiment based on how I'll eventually go about the entire topic of religion when I, believe it or not, have kids. I am also going to be asking some questions I've had on my mind that I haven't really seen anywhere on this platform. Not because there hasn't been anyone who has asked those questions, but because I feel they are just not asked right. I also don't want the title of the video to mislead you into thinking this is one of those videos that atheists make that put Christians in the corner they can't get out of logically. My honest intent is just to put these questions out here for people to really think hard and deeply about what it is they believe in and then make honest decisions based on their conclusions. Now before I go on, I'm going to have to come out of my closet and announce that I am actually an atheist, and I in no way or form believe in the existence of any god, both Christian or from any other belief system. But being an atheist and a scientifically minded one at that doesn't, and I might have to add, shouldn't give me the green card to go about harassing every religious person I come in contact with. Admittedly, however, I won't deny that I haven't done that in the past. I'm sure most of you agree with me that you develop some sort of anger and resentment when you first lose your faith and realize that you've been lied to all your life, and so you feel justified in trolling and trying to quote-unquote win every argument and, I am making giant air quotes here, debate you have with every Christian you meet, just to stick it to them and make them know how ridiculous they are for believing what they believe and how right and smart you are. So being someone who comes from a deeply intense Christian background, if I am using that term correctly, I have learned over the past few years of being an atheist that it's best to let some things go in order to retain some friends and family who would readily cut you off their lives when they learn of your apostasy. Now, while I am someone in support of militant atheism, as Richard Dawkins would call it, I also agree that people have the right to believe in whatever God they choose to believe in, as long as they keep it within themselves and their group and also not hurt anyone. I also think that no idea or belief is above criticism, ridicule or debate, unlike most Christians and religious people in general who do not hold such beliefs, as they tend to hold their values dearly and then revolt and disagree when those values are, well, evaluated. One example is the current portrayal of a gay drunk Jesus on a Netflix show that's got many Christians riled up enough to create a petition to cancel the show. The same thing they tried to do with another Netflix show, Lucifer, when it first premiered. So while I've got a shit ton of questions concerning the validity of the entire Bible, sometimes because I am genuinely curious and other times because, someone really has to ask, I'm only going to be focusing on the book of Genesis today, and most specifically, like I mentioned earlier, the creation story. One more thing, any average bloke who has done a bit of research would know that first of all, the book of Genesis isn't the first book of the Bible, and secondly, it wasn't written by a defected Egyptian prince called Moses. Instead, it's a book written by three different, howbeit unknown people at entirely different times. That's why some of the stories are conflicting and seem contradicting. Nonetheless, I'm going to be looking at it in the same context as Christians do today, as a book inspired by God and written by Moses, allegedly. So with all that said, I'm going to be starting my questions in somewhat no particular order. The first one being, and I actually don't expect anyone to have an answer, that when God said let there be light, what language was he speaking and where did he learn it from? Secondly, for him to have said light means that he must have recognized what light was enough for him to remember it and then command its creation. He went on to command the creation of other things with his mere words. So the question is, as chaotic as our universe seems, it still follows rules and laws. So what are the laws that govern the sporadic creation and existence of matter with just words? Are these laws based on physics, biology or chemistry? This is one question I haven't had a lot of people ask and I don't know why. However, I've asked some Christians and the best they could say was that it's all supernatural. In other words, God's magic. Now why would a God create intelligent beings and then keep the detailed explanation about their origin a secret, open to a few people who only need faith to believe it? That I don't know. But moving on though, how did he know that what he called out was exactly what came forth? If it didn't exist before, how did he know its name enough to affirm its form when it appeared? Does this mean that it may have existed somewhere else? Where else could it have existed in? I've heard answers like questions like these are not supposed to be asked because they are mysterious and apparently carnal-minded men like we atheists can't just get it. Again, the subject of faith comes into play, and so we're just supposed to accept the Bible's shallow explanations based on faith alone. I made an inquiry from a religious leader about what kind of tree the tree of knowledge of good and evil was, and he told me that it wasn't an actual tree, but that the Bible was being figurative and not literal, meaning that, in his words, the Garden of Eden was not an actual place but some sort of spiritual realm. But he failed to account for the fact that if it was a spiritual realm and the narrative was metaphoric, how about the plants and animals? Were they also figurative? I tried to make him know that the garden was described as a place that had 4 rivers flowing through it, one of which, according to the KJV, compassed the whole land of Ethiopia. Now, we all know that Ethiopia is a real place in Africa, and so it would have been absolutely impossible for the Garden of Eden along with the tree to be a spiritual realm. But of course, my explanation was brushed off as he continued to insist I didn't understand the scriptures well enough. I've also had arguments that the tree wasn't actually a tree, but sex. I have no idea why some folks would think that God restricted them from having sex when he already told them to be fruitful and multiply. But keeping that aside and moving on, because of the fact that nobody else had died, both literally and as we know now spiritually, given that they were, as the Bible claims, the first humans on earth, how were they supposed to understand what God meant by death when the very concept of death didn't exist yet? Some Christians have talked with claim that God must have told them all about that during his supposed many visits to them in the garden. But if that's the case, why did the talking snake tell them that they won't in fact die but be as wise as gods? What other gods existed? Keep in mind that there was another tree they were allowed to eat out of, the tree of life, which had the ability to make them immortal. And so we know that whether they sinned or not, they were eventually going to die unless they ate out of the tree of life, which God made sure wouldn't happen by guarding the garden with an angel and flaming swords when he drove them out of it. And so based on all this info, it's safe to say that God lied to them, which frankly isn't an unusual thing for him to do. There are more problems with the story. For example, if God really told them all they needed to know during his many visits, how were they supposed to understand the concept of choice when they didn't yet have the knowledge of what bad and good or right and wrong was? These were the first humans, and it would have been like talking to babies, which would have been difficult to make sense. Christians always argue that they were able to display some level of choice and that's why they chose to disobey God. But you see, the thing with choice is that it only works when there are options. Naturally, for one to choose means one prefers something over another. That thing then usually is considered good for the person making the choice. So they couldn't have been able to choose if they didn't yet have the concept of preference. But let's say they chose to disobey God, to fail God's test. How long was this test supposed to last? What was God's aim for putting the tree there? Was it going to be removed eventually? Did the test have a limited time, or was the tree supposed to be there until someone eventually ate out of it? What was the motive of the test when the tester, God in this case, who is supposedly omniscient, knows every possible outcome of the test? What kind of kindergarten teacher puts a loaded gun amongst other toys in the midst of kids, then nonchalantly asks them not to touch the weapon because they could get hurt, and then leaves the room? What kind of father punishes his grand, great-grand, and even great-great-grandchildren because his first 3-year-old ate the ice cream in the fridge that his dad asked him not to touch? Are these questions not worth asking? And most especially, are these traits really of an all-knowing, all-forgiving God? Because again, when they failed this supposed test, why was their punishment, or as Christians call it, the consequence of their choice, so harsh even though they were first-time offenders? The thing with consequences is that they occur naturally. For example, hunger is a consequence of skipping meals and failure is a consequence of not studying properly for an exam. But the punishment of Adam, Eve and the serpent are artificial consequences that easily could have been overlooked because again, they were first-time offenders and the one who set the test was aware of all the outcomes. So condemning man to a lifetime of suffering and woman to pains during childbirth is an unnatural consequence of eating a fruit. It's almost as if they were set up to inevitably fail so that their punishment could be a cheap excuse by a not so good writer to take in the plot of this story. I mean, has anyone ever imagined how life could have been like if Adam and Eve never ate from the tree? Imagine millions of people all naked, unaware that they are, running about shoving penises and breasts in each other's faces. What would they have done if winter came? How would they have protected themselves? With leaves? What is the difference between protecting yourselves from cold with leaves and covering your nakedness with said leaves? What kind of houses would they have lived in? How are all the minerals, rocks and gases buried underneath the earth? Would we have ever been able to make use of them? Would we have been able to eventually turn cotton into clothes or grapes into wine? Would have the rest of the world been allowed to be explored, or was the Garden of Eden supposed to be our forever home? Since suffering didn't exist yet and man wasn't going to sweat for his meals, how would have the advent of agriculture been like? Would plants have been able to grow 100 times faster? Would we have been conscious enough to one day go to the moon, or would our lives have been entirely in servitude to this God? You see, I think that man was destined to fail this test. I think that the God of the Bible knew that even for someone as narcissistic as he is, life as we thankfully do not know it would have been terribly boring. And so he set up all that drama so that man will eventually fail, and then life, as imperfect as it currently is, would be the best outcome. But how about our curious, truth-speaking, talking serpent? Christians always argue that it was possessed by the devil. So why was it cursed to forever crawl in its belly and doomed to eat dust the rest of its life? What kind of serpent eats dust? Also, what kind of serpent was it that tempted Eve? And why was every other species of snakes affected by this curse? Were animals like eels, snails, worms and slugs also affected, or were they naturally created that way? If they were, why would God create some animals without legs and then condemn some other animals who previously had legs to crawl? Now, according to Genesis 1:30, all animals eat plants, regardless of their different and diverse features both for hunting and surviving. But then some animals became hungry for flesh after the fall of man, meaning that regardless of the morphology and anthropology of apex predators like lions and eagles and sharks, they all eat plants. Again, I have asked this question and the best answer I could get was that all animals somehow changed after the fall of man. Now, if this is true, why did the taste for blood affect some animals and skip some? And what did the carnivorous plants like the Venus flytrap and the pitcher plant eat? That unsurprisingly had no answer. Finally, who was Cain's wife? Now, the Bible makes it clear that Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, but Abel was murdered by Cain, who was exiled by God and condemned to be an outcast. Cain goes to the land of Nod and finds a wife there. To cut the story short, they have a kid named Enoch, and then Cain builds a city. Naturally, Christians blow this one up too by saying that Cain's wife could have been his sister, and boy does that open an entire Pandora's box of problems. First of all, we know they had another child in their grief over the death of Abel. This child was named Seth. We also know that from the time Adam was created to the time Seth was born was a period of 130 years. After that, the Bible specifically says that Adam lived for 800 more years, during which he bore more sons and daughters, and then at the ripe age of 930, he died. So based on that info, no other children existed until after the birth of Seth. Now here's where we run into the bigger problem. Let's admit this mystery woman was Cain's sister. I mean, wouldn't that be incest, and wouldn't that make any child they have either stillborn or biologically retarded? Medically speaking, most kids who are born from incest almost always are riddled with unthinkable diseases and disorder, and so unless we play the God's magic trick card, it's virtually impossible for them to have had a healthy child or a child at all. But then again, let's suppose that's true. If incest was necessary for the multiplication of humankind on so many occasions in the Bible, why is it currently a sin? Why is it frowned on both socially and traditionally? If something was known to always work, why change it and condemn it? Now, while I am in no way in support of incest, I still understand that there is nothing wrong with two consenting adults playing into their deepest, albeit weird sexual desires. But then, why is it that the offspring have to suffer for their parents' weird stupidity? Oh wait, he's known for that sort of thing. But that's it guys, those are some of the questions I've had about the creation story. Questions that have been on my mind for as long as I can remember. But like I said before, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind about this. I'm just trying to make anyone who has watched and listened up to this point be aware of these questions. As laughably ridiculous as the Bible is, it's still trying to send a message. It's still trying to tell a story. A wrong story, but a story nonetheless. That's what we humans do. We tell stories about a lot of things to give us closure and some sort of purpose or connection. But in the wise words of Carl Sagan, knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and in reality that's what science is all about, the quest for knowledge, regardless of how it may make us feel. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments, and leave a thumbs up or downs, and I'll talk to you all some other time. I'm done.